Throughout history, great civilizations have risen to incredible heights, only to mysteriously collapse. The mighty Roman Empire, spanning 3 continents, crumbled into dust. The Maya, masters of astronomy and architecture, abandoned their magnificent cities to the jungle. And they're not alone. From the ancient Sumerians to the Indus Valley civilization, the pattern repeats itself across cultures and millennia. But why? What invisible force brings these giants to their knees? And, perhaps most chillingly, could it happen to us? Welcome to CEO's Library, the 1% bookshelf, where we dive into the most impactful books shaping our world. I'm your host, and today we're exploring a fascinating work that tackles these very questions. The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter. Now you might be thinking, ancient history? How is this relevant to me? But stick with me, because the insights in this book are startlingly applicable to our modern world. Whether you're a business leader, a policymaker, or just someone trying to understand the changes happening around us, Tainter's work offers a powerful lens for viewing both past and present. In the next half hour, we'll unpack Tainter's groundbreaking theory, examine a compelling historical case study, and consider what it all means for our future. So buckle up. We're about to embark on a journey through time that just might change how you see the world. Let's start by painting a picture of what societal collapse actually looks like. Now forget the Hollywood version with sudden catastrophes and dramatic explosions. Real collapses, as Tainter describes them, are more like a slow unraveling. Imagine a complex tapestry. Over time, threads start to come loose. At first, it's barely noticeable, but gradually more and more threads unravel until the once beautiful image becomes unrecognizable. That's societal collapse. Specifically, Tainter identifies several key features. First, there's a rapid, significant loss of an established level of social complexity. What does that mean in practical terms? Well, think about all the specialized roles in our society. Doctors, lawyers, engineers, artists. In a collapse, many of these specialized positions disappear. Second, there's a breakdown of centralized control. The government's ability to regulate and coordinate different parts of society weakens dramatically. Third, there's less trade and exchange between different regions. The economic ties that bind a society together start to fray. Fourth, there's a decline in art, literature, and other cultural expressions. The resources and stability needed for these pursuits simply aren't there anymore. And finally, there's often a significant drop in population. This can be due to various factors: famine, disease, conflict, or simply people leaving the area. Now let's look at some historical examples to make this more concrete. The Roman Empire is probably the most famous case. At its height, it was a marvel of organization. It had a complex legal system, a vast network of roads, aqueducts bringing fresh water to cities, and a military that could respond to threats across 3 continents. But by the 5th century AD, all of this was crumbling. The western half of the empire fractured into smaller kingdoms. Cities shrank, trade declined, and much of the sophisticated infrastructure fell into disrepair. Or consider the Maya of Central America. They built incredible cities with towering pyramids, developed a sophisticated writing system, and made impressive advances in mathematics and astronomy. But around 900 AD, something went wrong. Over the course of about a century, their great cities were abandoned. The population plummeted, and the complex society they had built disintegrated. We see similar patterns with the Indus Valley civilization in ancient India, the Mycenaean civilization in Greece, and many others. The details vary, but the overall trajectory is the same. A society reaches a peak of complexity and achievement, then experiences a dramatic simplification and decentralization. This brings us to a crucial question. Why does this pattern repeat itself across such different cultures and time periods? What common thread links the fall of Rome to the abandonment of Mayan cities? Many theories have been proposed over the years. Some blame environmental factors like climate change or resource depletion. Others point to external threats like invasions. Still others focus on internal issues like class conflict or political mismanagement. But Joseph Tainter argues that while these factors may play a role, they don't get to the heart of the matter. He proposes a more fundamental explanation, one that applies across cultures and time periods, and that brings us to his key insight, the concept of declining returns on complexity. To understand Tainter's theory, we need to start with a basic premise. Human societies are problem-solving organizations. When faced with challenges, whether it's producing enough food, defending against enemies, or managing a growing population, societies respond by becoming more complex. This complexity can take many forms. It might involve creating new social roles or institutions, developing new technologies, or establishing more elaborate systems of control and coordination. And for a long time, this increased complexity pays off. It allows societies to produce more food, build impressive monuments, support larger populations, and generally achieve things that wouldn't be possible for simpler societies. But, and this is the crucial point, Tainter argues that this process of increasing complexity eventually reaches a point of diminishing returns. In other words, societies have to invest more and more to get less and less benefit. Let's break this down with an analogy. Imagine you're running a business. At first, every dollar you invest brings significant returns. You hire employees, buy equipment, expand your product line, and your profits soar. But over time, it gets harder to find profitable opportunities. You might spend a lot of money on a new marketing campaign, only to see a tiny bump in sales. Or you might develop an expensive new product that only appeals to a small niche of customers. That's essentially what Tainter is describing, but on a societal scale. Early investments in complexity bring big payoffs, but over time, the returns diminish, while the costs keep rising. Let's look at some concrete examples of how this plays out. In agriculture, the first innovations, like irrigation systems or crop rotation, can dramatically increase food production. But each subsequent improvement tends to yield smaller gains, while often requiring more labor or resources. In bureaucracy, initial organization can greatly improve efficiency. But as administrative structures grow, they often become bloated and less effective, requiring more resources just to maintain the status quo. In military affairs, early advances in technology or strategy can provide a significant edge. But as rivals catch up, maintaining superiority requires ever-increasing investments for diminishing advantages. Even in areas like scientific research, we see this pattern. The first discoveries in a field often come relatively easily and have wide-ranging impacts. But as our knowledge deepens, it takes more specialized equipment, larger teams, and bigger budgets to push the boundaries further, often for more incremental gains. Now, why does this matter? Because it makes societies increasingly vulnerable to collapse. As the costs of maintaining complexity rise and the benefits decline, the whole system becomes more and more fragile. It has less surplus, less ability to respond to new challenges, and eventually it reaches a point where maintaining that level of complexity is simply no longer worth it. This is where Tainter's insight becomes really powerful. He argues that collapse, far from being a failure or a catastrophe, is often an economizing process. It's a rational response to declining returns on investment in complexity. When the costs of maintaining a complex society outweigh the benefits, it makes economic sense to simplify, to collapse to a lower level of complexity. Of course, this doesn't mean collapse is pleasant for those living through it. The loss of social complexity often involves significant hardship and disruption. But from a broader perspective, it's a way for a society to reset, to shed unsustainable levels of complexity, and return to a more manageable state. This theory helps explain why collapses often seem to happen quite suddenly, even when the underlying problems have been building for a long time. It's like a rubber band being stretched. It can absorb more and more tension, but once it reaches a critical point, it snaps all at once. It also helps explain why societies often fail to prevent collapse, even when the signs are clear. The investments in complexity have become so ingrained, so central to how the society functions, that scaling back isn't seen as an option. Instead, they often double down on complexity, trying to solve problems by adding even more complex solutions, which only hastens the collapse. Now, this might all sound a bit abstract, so let's ground it in a concrete historical example, the collapse of the Roman Empire. The story of Rome's rise and fall has captivated historians for centuries. It's a tale of astonishing success, followed by a dramatic unraveling, and it provides a perfect case study for Tainter's theory of collapse. Rome's ascent was spectacular. From humble beginnings as a small city-state, it grew to dominate the entire Mediterranean world and beyond. At its peak, the Roman Empire stretched from Britain to Egypt, from Spain to the Middle East. It was a marvel of organization and engineering, with a complex system of laws, a vast network of roads, impressive public works, and a powerful military. But how did Rome achieve this remarkable growth? In large part through increasing complexity. As Rome expanded, it developed more sophisticated political institutions, a more elaborate economic system, and increasingly complex military organizations. Each new problem was met with new layers of social complexity. Initially, this strategy paid off handsomely. The spoils of conquest provided the resources to fund further expansion and internal development. The complex Roman system allowed for unprecedented levels of economic production, political control, and military power. But over time, the returns on this complexity began to diminish. Let's look at a few specific areas. Military affairs. In the early days of expansion, Roman conquests brought in huge amounts of wealth and new resources. But as the empire reached its natural limits, the costs of maintaining and defending such a vast territory began to outweigh the benefits. The army had to grow larger and more expensive, just to hold on to existing territories rather than acquire new ones. Administration. As the empire grew, so did its bureaucracy. What started as a relatively simple system of governance became increasingly complex and costly. More and more resources had to be devoted just to keeping the administrative machinery running. Economic policy. Faced with rising costs, Roman emperors resorted to devaluing the currency. This provided short-term relief, but led to long-term economic instability. Inflation became a serious problem, eroding the wealth of citizens and making it harder for the state to finance its operations. Infrastructure. Rome's impressive infrastructure, its roads, aqueducts, and public buildings, required constant maintenance. As the system aged, more and more resources had to be devoted to upkeep rather than new development. In each of these areas, we see the pattern Tainter describes: increasing investments in complexity, yielding diminishing returns. The Roman state had to expend more and more resources just to maintain the status quo, leaving it with less capacity to deal with new challenges. And challenges there were. In the 3rd century AD, Rome faced a perfect storm of problems: external invasions, internal civil wars, economic troubles, and a devastating plague. Earlier in its history, Rome might have had the resilience to weather these crises, but now, weakened by the diminishing returns on its complex systems, it struggled to cope. The empire's response to these challenges is telling. Rather than simplifying or scaling back, it doubled down on complexity. The Emperor Diocletian, for instance, implemented a sweeping reorganization of the empire in an attempt to strengthen central control. He expanded the bureaucracy, imposed stricter economic regulations, and increased the size of the army. In the short term, these measures helped stabilize the situation. But they also dramatically increased the costs of running the empire. Taxes had to be raised to ruinous levels to support the expanded state apparatus. This put an enormous strain on the population, especially the farmers who formed the backbone of the economy. As Tainter puts it, the empire was investing ever more heavily in a strategy that yielded proportionately less. The marginal returns on investment in imperial complexity had declined to the point where many Roman citizens found their situation intolerable. In some frontier areas, people actually welcomed barbarian invaders as preferable to the crushing burden of Roman taxation. The final collapse of the Western Roman Empire in the 5th century AD wasn't caused by a single catastrophic event. Rather, it was the culmination of this long process of declining returns on complexity. The complex Roman system, which had once been a source of strength, had become an unsustainable burden. In the aftermath of the collapse, we see exactly what Tainter's theory predicts: a significant simplification of society. The elaborate Roman administrative system disappeared. Long-distance trade declined dramatically. Cities shrank or were abandoned. Literacy rates plummeted. The level of social complexity regressed to something more sustainable given the resources available. It's a sobering tale, but what does it mean for us today? Are there lessons we can draw from Rome's fall? As we consider the implications of Tainter's theory for our modern world, it's hard not to see some unsettling parallels. Like Rome, our global civilization has achieved unprecedented levels of complexity. We have intricate economic systems, elaborate technological infrastructures, and complex international political arrangements. And like Rome, we're facing a host of challenges that strain these complex systems. Consider a few examples. Our financial systems have become so complex that even experts struggle to fully understand them. This complexity contributed to the 2008 financial crisis and continues to pose risks today. Our technological infrastructure, while incredibly powerful, is also increasingly vulnerable. Cybersecurity threats, for instance, require ever more sophisticated and costly defenses. In medicine, we're seeing diminishing returns on research investment. Despite enormous funding, breakthroughs in many areas are becoming harder to achieve. Our political systems are struggling to address complex global issues like climate change, requiring ever more elaborate international agreements and regulations. In each of these areas, we might ask, are we approaching a point of diminishing returns on complexity? Are we investing more and more to achieve less and less? It's a troubling question. But before we panic, it's important to note some key differences between our situation and that of ancient Rome. First, we have a much deeper understanding of how societies and economies work. We have tools like systems thinking and computer modeling that allow us to analyze complex problems in ways the Romans couldn't have imagined. Second, our technological capabilities far exceed anything in the ancient world. We have the potential to develop new energy sources, more efficient production methods, and other innovations that could shift the equation of costs and benefits. Third, we have a global system of knowledge sharing that allows innovations and solutions to spread rapidly. This increases our collective problem-solving capacity. These factors don't make us immune to the dynamics Tainter describes, but they do give us more options for responding to them. So what can we do to avoid the fate of Rome and other collapsed civilizations? Here are a few potential strategies. 1. Prioritize efficiency and simplification. Instead of always adding new layers of complexity to solve problems, we should look for ways to streamline and simplify our systems where possible. 2. Invest in breakthrough technologies. Developments in areas like renewable energy, artificial intelligence, or biotechnology could potentially shift the curve of returns on complexity. 3. Foster resilience and adaptability. We need to build systems that can flex and adapt to challenges rather than brittle structures that shatter under stress. 4. Promote global cooperation. Many of our biggest challenges require coordinated global action. We need to find ways to work together effectively across national boundaries. 5. Educate and engage the public. The more people understand these dynamics, the better equipped we'll be to address them collectively. Ultimately, the goal is to find a sustainable level of complexity, one that allows us to solve our problems and continue advancing as a civilization without crossing into the realm of diminishing returns. It's a daunting challenge, but understanding the patterns of history gives us a powerful tool. By recognizing the dynamics that have led to past collapses, we have the opportunity to chart a different course. As we wrap up, let's recap the key points we've covered. Societal collapse is a recurrent feature of human history, characterized by a rapid loss of social complexity. Joseph Tainter argues that this pattern is driven by declining returns on investments in societal complexity. The Roman Empire provides a vivid example of how this process can play out, with increasing complexity eventually becoming an unsustainable burden. Our modern global civilization shows some concerning parallels, but also has unique advantages that could help us avoid a similar fate. The challenge for us is to recognize these dynamics and find ways to maintain a sustainable level of complexity. Understanding these patterns isn't just an academic exercise, it's crucial knowledge for anyone trying to navigate our complex modern world. Whether you're a business leader making strategic decisions, a policymaker shaping the future of your community, or simply a citizen trying to make sense of global trends, Tainter's insights offer a valuable perspective. I hope this episode has piqued your interest in these ideas. If you want to dive deeper, I highly recommend getting a copy of Tainter's book, The Collapse of Complex Societies. It's a challenging read, but one that will fundamentally change how you view history and current events. You'll find a link to purchase the book in our show notes. Remember, knowledge is power. By understanding the forces shaping our world, we put ourselves in a better position to influence them. Let's use these lessons from history to build a more resilient and sustainable future. This is CEO's Library, the 1% Bookshelf. Until next time, keep reading, keep thinking, and keep striving to understand our complex world.